Now, thank you again to our CTO panelists for joining us. I think it would be amiss to not provide the audience with a bit more insight into who you are and the career that led you to your current role. So I'm going to ask each of you to give yourselves a more in-depth introduction, starting with Roisin and moving around the room to Doug, then Anshul and Ian. So take it away, Roisin. Tell everyone a brief background on your career to date.
Thanks, Laura. How much time do I have?
Two-ish minutes.
2 minutes. All right, so we'll keep it brief. So I think, hi everyone again. My name's Roisin Parkes. So obviously I'm Irish, as you can tell by the accent and maybe the name. So my career has been split between Australia and Ireland. My last role was at Gumtree as CTO, where I was there in that role for 4 years. My path to CTO, I started out by attending a university in Ireland and studied computer systems. So a really kind of deep understanding of programming kind of from the start. And then went in and joined a startup in Ireland at the time called Iona Technologies, which was a great company to work for. And in a number of different roles, some in engineering, some in professional services. And that kind of gave me a good grounding of a mix of customer facing and engineering roles. And then several different engineering roles and kind of team lead roles, and eventually joined a company called Dun & Bradstreet, where I had a kind of number of different roles, both in technology, but also in strategy and product. And I think that gave me a good grounding, again, in different aspects of, what it takes to be a CTO. And then finally, I moved back to Australia, and I actually moved with the company Dun & Bradstreet. I wasn't really sure what sort of a role I wanted here in Australia, and maybe that's something we could discuss later on in the piece, but I was really looking for a role, a kind of technical product lead role, and there wasn't really that same type of role here in Australia as there was in Europe. So with some good advice and a bit of feedback on my CV and my LinkedIn profile, I eventually started looking for more technical leadership roles, and was approached about the role at Gumtree. So that's it in a nutshell. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks, Roisin. Over to you, Doug.
Thanks, Laura. So I guess, yes, similar to Roisin, I started off with a degree in software engineering originally, and then after graduating, I for a couple of years I was in a couple of different tech consulting companies, Hewlett Packard Consulting here in Australia, and then I spent a couple of years over in the UK working for EDS. I found myself back in Australia taking up a role in National Australia Bank. So I started there originally, I guess, as a developer, as a programmer. Had lots of different opportunities over 5 years there. So some of them were in tech leadership, some of them were eventually in more like line management and solution design type roles. I ended up in an enterprise architecture role, which was fascinating because I was working with some really, really smart people and seeing a really sort of bird's eye view of the bank, but also immensely frustrating because it was so difficult to actually see any drive change. And it was with one of my colleagues there that we both basically quit at the same time and tried our hand at a startup, which wasn't Culture Amp at that stage. So we basically spent 2 years doing all the wrong things, like focusing entirely on the engineering side of things and not worrying about not focusing on sales and marketing and business plans and so forth. So after 2 years of playing with a lot of cool tech, but not making the progress that we expected from the build it and they'll come approach, ended up joining forces with the rest of the co-founders of Culture Amp, and it started on that journey with a bit more learning. That's now been, well, pretty much from like 2009 onwards. So it's been quite a journey from there. So Culture Amp, we started obviously with 4 co-founders. And so I'd say what we wasn't really originally a CTO role. If anything, one of my other co-founders was kind of taking the lead on the on the engineering side of things. And as founders, it was basically just all hands on deck. So, you know, as an example, I was spending most of my time building product, but, you know, the 10% job for me was doing all the finances of the company, simply because I cared about it more than my other co-founders in terms of making sure bills are paid and people are paid and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, then I guess as the company grew, you know, I probably had a bit more experience in terms of leading engineering teams, and kind of naturally fell into the CTO role once we got to like five or so developers, and have kind of been on that journey since. So initially it was very much matching to the experience that I had in NAB and so forth. And then as the company grew, it was stretched into entirely different roles. So I feel like I've kind of had every different type of CTO role right up until now, where it's sort of a, you know, a 450 or so person company with about 150 of those, I guess, in the product area.
Awesome journey. Thank you for sharing that. Anshul?
Thanks, Doug. So my journey is a little bit different. I started, I guess, programming in high school, loved it. I actually started building websites for people. So then I obviously went to uni. I studied computer science, all the while doing this website building thing on the side. Eventually it kind of got really big. And one of my clients at the time was a little startup, home services startup called Home Hello. And they raised a bit of money, and they were like, hey, why don't you drop the thesis that you're working on that nobody's ever going to read and come join us. So I ended up doing that. And we kind of built the business for a few years, ended up selling it off after a while, learned a lot of the things Doug mentioned, building the wrong things and focusing on a lot of the wrong things. But we ended up with a successful outcome in the end. And I kind of got to the end of that, and I was pretty sick of writing code. So I built up a bit of an engineering team there, but I was predominantly wearing that kind of, I guess in a small engineering team, wearing the lead engineer hat, and doing a bit of thinking around product because nobody else really knew what to do with it, and I was closest to it. So I got to the end of that and decided to actually just jump entirely into product management. So I went over to freelancer.com and spent a few years there, and ended up, I guess, leading a bunch of engineering teams, which was super valuable experience because it also kind of taught me all the important non-engineering things about engineering. And at the end of that, I jumped over to Amazon and went to an incredibly large company where, again, product and engineering are just done very, very differently. And I mean, now I'm at Elenta. I came through the Antler program successfully, kind of amazing journey coming through that. But I guess the hat I'm wearing now is going back to what I was doing in the very early days of Home Hello. I'm kind of owning a lot of the engineering. I write a lot of code, but like Doug, I do a lot of things. I led a lot of our fundraising. I do a lot of our finances, doing kind of sales, design, whatever really needs to get done. And yeah, that's me.
Great. And over to you, Ian.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name's Ian Glass. I'm the CTO of Intalayer. I guess my journey started as a young kid, much to my parents' dismay, pulling apart VCRs and other home appliances and not really putting them back together. I developed an interest in electronics engineering, so I studied that at university. I moved on to study biomedical engineering. And then, so my startup journey started probably in 2015, where I co-founded a haptic feedback hardware startup. It was aimed at helping people who are visually impaired. I then got a support-facing or customer-facing support development role, where I saw a lot of the problems that Intalayer is trying to solve. And at the same time, I also worked on another hardware startup aimed as like a safety device proximity sensor for roading construction. That's kind of the point when I realized that I need a lot of help selling things. Engineers weren't really made to sell things. So I got on a plane and went to Australia and joined the Antler program, where I met my now co-founders, Michael Wendland and Dane Welsman. So yeah, we founded Intalayer, and it's been going well ever since.
Great, thank you for sharing your backgrounds. I think it's pretty clear early in this conversation that there's not one right way to get into the CTO role, which leads me to my next question. What do you see as prerequisites for taking on the CTO role? So if you put that another way, if you were to hire a CTO to replace you, what would they need to be able to do?
I can take a stab at that one. I think obviously people leadership is a key component of a CTO role. So not just the technology side of things, but also, good coaching skills, I think, as a leader. I think the CTO role can vary hugely from company to company. So it kind of depends on the company itself. But if I was to find a replacement for a CTO at Gumtree, for example, they would need to also have significant influencing skills to be able to get the investments needed, across the business for the technology. I also think, and again, this varies from company to company, but the CTO role at Gumtree, it needs to be quite commercially focused as well. So a good balance of technical decision making, but also balancing that against business objectives. I think they're the core things I'd look for.
Anshul, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think, yeah, like to your point, it probably depends largely on the size of company as well. Like if you think about small companies, you're spending a lot of your time writing code. Depending on your co-founders, you're probably spending a lot of time thinking about product. And as the company gets bigger and bigger, then your role kind of becomes more and more focused on less about actually writing code and more about like, how do I manage teams of people who can produce a lot of code effectively. And, as Roisin said, it's more of a leadership, operational type of role as opposed to, very architecturally heavy or technical.
Before we move on from you, we had a question from the audience. Anshul, what was your thesis on?
Combinatorial optimization, which computer scientists may get. I don't want to digress too far in that direction.
Sounds fascinating. Okay, I'll toss this next one over to you, Doug. For somebody that wants to go into a CTO role, how would a CTO role differ from what the expectations might be?
Interesting question. I think as Anshul was talking about, I think the CTO role is quite different for different sizes of companies. One of the talks I remember from a CTO conference I went to years ago that really crystallized for me the different needs at different sizes of company talked about 4 different archetypes. The first archetype they called the Incredible Hulk, which is kind of the very early stage startup where the CTO is basically, it's pretty much exactly as you'd imagine with the Incredible Hulk. This person that's out in front, like basically the 10x engineer, if you like, that's smashing boulders and forging a path forward for their team. And I think exactly what that talk was sort of talking about is that the challenge is as the company grows, the effectiveness of that archetype of CTO starts to diminish. And so, once you've got to the stage where you have, say, 10 engineers all trying to follow someone that's out in front smashing boulders is not particularly effective, because you need much more of that coordination type role. So the second archetype they talked about was the engineer, which I think is probably the one that I fitted very comfortably in when I took over the role, which is more of the oversee and coordinate and be involved in everything, but also let go of things, and focus very much on the design, the architecture, how things fit together, and connecting everything. And that style of CTO works really well up until about, say, 50 engineers. And after that point, it becomes too difficult for that person to keep across everything and keep their hands across everything, and things start to break down. And so the next archetype they talk about, they call the general. I'm not sure if that's necessarily a great analogy, but I do get the point, which is that you need someone who can actually have essentially lieutenants, if you like, who are able to do that in a whole series of different areas of the business. And the job of the CTO much more becomes the coordinator and connector, setting that strategic direction, setting the vision, keeping everybody aligned and moving in the same direction without getting bogged down in the details of any one given team. And that style of CTO lasts pretty much up until the company becomes the dominant player in their market. So that's a style of CTO that can last for a very long time. But once you actually reach the point where there's really nowhere left to expand, you are the dominant player. The fourth type of CTO, they call the celebrity, which is basically someone who's entirely externally focused. They have other people who are running all the internals, and they're very much the face of the company. They're working on partnership deals. They're selling to the market. They're basically trying to convince everybody that all those up and coming tech companies that are coming into the space are not worth going to, because you've got to go with the tried and proven. So, I mean, for me, I think I definitely started as the engineer, and a lot of my challenge and a lot of my growth has been focusing on how do I become more of that general archetype and letting go of a lot of my sort of natural inclinations around the engineer archetype. And I'm definitely resigned to the fact that I'm never going to be the celebrity. So if Culture Amp ever gets that big, I'm handing the reins over to someone who can be more externally focused. Yeah, in terms, does that answer the question? It's kind of a slightly tangent, but
yeah, no,
that's about the space.
A fascinating breakdown of the archetypes. It was interesting. I was chatting to another one of our portfolio companies just the other day and asked her to describe what CEO archetype she felt like she aligned with, and it just wasn't even something that she'd considered. So, and I haven't heard that archetype structure for CTOs. So that's a fascinating framework to run the thinking and personality and skills alignment through. Following on from that, I don't know who might want to weigh in on this one, but what's the difference between VP of engineering and CTO, and how do you kind of cross that line?
I can certainly talk to that one, given that we've had a VP of engineering and a CTO, and we've spent years struggling with exactly that question. And I think it is challenging, and I think probably it depends very much company to company and the partnership in terms of I think one advantage of having a CTO and a VP of engineering is that if you get the right partnership, you've got someone that covers the other person's strengths, well, as in strengths and weaknesses that partner well. So I think probably the first thing is, what, as a CTO, what are your strengths and what are your weaknesses? And then based on that, what sort of VP of engineering do you need to partner well with you to help cover some of those weaknesses? But I mean, talking a little bit more generally, I would say, you know, similar to what Roisin was talking about before, my view of the CTO role is it's very much a business role first and foremost. So it's working in the exec team. It's spending the time to understand where's the company trying to go, where are you trying to head, where's the strategic vision, and then what is the tech vision that backs that. And then I think the VP of engineering's role is to take that and be more of the coordinator of the engineers on the ground. So, you know, who do we need in what roles? How do we get them? How do we manage all of the disparate pieces of work? How do we make sure that they're running on time? My VP of engineering used to talk about his job being to keep the trains running. I think it's a lot more than that, but I think that it's an interesting analogy. But yes.
Awesome answer. Anshul, were you getting ready to jump in on that? No, okay. So the next question that I wanted to toss over to Ian was around going from the start into growth mode. And so thinking about the key things that you need at the start and what changes as you move into growth mode, and what signals someone who's actually going to be able to grow with the company in that role?
I'll try my best. We're still pretty early, but I think, you know, someone who naturally takes up the role of like nurturing curiosity, because they're just going to naturally fall into a leadership position. People sort of formulate around them, you know, if you're nurturing and sort of, I guess, mentoring people as well. So it's probably a characteristic that I kind of regard quite highly, is that kind of curiosity and willingness to take the time to explain things in a way that people understand. So like understanding their learning patterns, because yeah, you'll just formulate a great team around you, and that's just how you get things done.
Great. Anshul, you've kind of moved through a couple of different stages. So how did you find transitioning from kind of being on the tools, as it were, to managing teams?
Yeah, so if I think about the first transition where I went through that, like I went from, I guess, fairly smallish startup, like 20, 30 people, where I had a few engineers. I was the Hulk archetype. And I kind of hired people and I was like, all right, you guys go do this, but I was very close to them. And I never really learned how to manage. And then I went to freelancer, where I mean, like in hindsight, I never really knew how to manage anyone. I think it's a super important skill set, and one which Hulk or engineer archetypes tend to, I guess, dismiss easily. And like, it takes you a while to kind of appreciate the importance of it. And first you manage people, and then you get managed by someone who's really good. And you appreciate like what an impact it has on performance, and kind of, to Doug's point earlier, letting go, kind of like giving away the tools a bit more, and not having to have all of your opinions and how everything is built, and realizing your time is incredibly high leverage if you can actually empower the people below you to think in the way which you would have otherwise done it. And so your role goes more to, how can I coach this person to think about the problem in a way which I would have thought about it, or in a better way even.
Great. I might toss this one over to you, Roisin. A question on how do you balance your time? You've got a lot of pressures, a lot of responsibilities. It's really easy to keep getting dragged into the operational stuff. So how much time do you dedicate for R&D? How much time do you dedicate for strategy?
I would say it's not linear. Like, it can vary quite a bit depending on where the organization is and what the challenges and pressures of a particular business might be at a particular time. I think if, for example, your company has gone through a period of massive scale, and you suddenly are in a position where the technology is creaking and needs some help, then you may find that you're spending quite a bit of time building a strategy and a vision for how you're actually going to improve that technology, or pay down your tech debt, or whatever it is. So you might spend a lot of time there. You might also be in a company, for example, that's not hitting its budget or hitting its targets, in which case you are spending an awful lot of your time focused on how you can support the rest of the business in achieving their objectives, which might look very different. So I'd say there's no kind of clear breakdown of what that should be. My only caveat on that may be that you should always be focused a certain percentage of your time on making sure your tech debt is not getting too big, and that you have kind of a long-term vision for where you're taking your infrastructure. But from carving out your day-to-day, the days can look very different depending on what's happening at the company.
And as you're spending your time on strategy and R&D and externally facing all of these other pressures, how do you make sure that you're not drifting too far from working knowledge of the code base and what's happening within the tech stack?
So I think this is a great question, because this is something I get asked a lot, and particularly if people are moving from a very hands-on technical role into a leadership role. I would say there's two things. First of all, just because you're not coding doesn't mean you're now suddenly not technical. There's an expectation around the technical knowledge that you have, whether you're coding or not. So that does need to continue. Those skills need to be continue to be grown. My only thing, though, again, is as your team size grows, and back to Doug's point earlier, once you get over a certain size, you need to actually let go and trust your team, because if you're not doing that, it's going to be very difficult for your team to actually scale and to be able to do the things that they need to do. So you need to kind of change your mindset a little bit, move away from the code base, even though that might be really difficult to do, especially if you've been a CTO that's been there from the very beginning. That's really difficult to kind of step back. But you need to trust your team. You need to trust the people that report to you, that they're actually going to be able to take on the mantle, because if you keep dipping in, then they're not going to hold themselves accountable for making sure everything's on track. So it's very hard to do, but definitely as the size of the team grows, you need to step back.
And when you're looking to bring people into this type of role, how much do you weight formal qualifications versus experience?
For a CTO role? That's a very good question. I would say, yeah, that's a very good question. I think my so the role that I've played for the last 4 years has had, there's been very little of that's been dependent on my degree. I think it looks very different from, an engineering role straight out of college, obviously. I think that a lot of companies put kind of a prerequisite on you having some sort of a degree. I don't think it matters whether that's a degree in psychology, a degree in engineering, or a degree in something else. When you get to this level, because it's all about the experience that you've gained along the way, and that experience can be massively different. So I would say, a degree is not essential for this role. I think you probably find that there's quite a few CTOs out there who have grown the company from the ground up, and not necessarily finished a degree or even went to college at all. I would say it's 80% at least the experience.
Thank you for that. So if you're trying to apply for one of these roles without the formal qualification, Doug, maybe you can comment on what skill sets would they need to have on their CV? How are they going to get past the robo screen?
I'm muted. Good question. I guess I'd start by saying I totally agree with Roisin. Like, for me, it's much more about experience than it is the qualifications. Like, the qualification can be useful if you're, trying to get a visa in a different country. But beyond that, I think very much it's about the experience. So I guess what I'd be looking for, especially if I was trying to find a replacement as a CTO, is who's got experience running similar size and complexity of companies in a similar role. And ideally, people who have helped to significantly grow the company in that role. And I think that's probably the main thing. I mean, one of the one of the interviews that we use quite heavily in our interview process is called the Who interview. And it's basically an interview style where we literally walk through their resume, and we start with their very first job after uni, or if they haven't been to uni, just their first job in the industry. And what we're interested in is the story behind. So it's, why did they join that company, and why did they leave? And there's a bunch of questions around what they think their manager at the time would have seen as their strengths and their weaknesses, what they're most proud of, and those sorts of things. And what we're trying to understand is the journey. We're looking for people who are growth mindset, who are ideally pulled to companies by other people, so being recommended to companies, and who are joining companies for the right reasons, as in they're really passionate about the mission. They're they're keen to kind of work in great places for great cultures and those sorts of things. So I think, to me, that's important regardless of role. But I think on top of that, with the CTO, I think I'm definitely looking for someone that's got lots of experience in the tech space, but also has a real interest and passion for the business side, and has been that translator in a bunch of different roles. Someone who's had a lot of experience in hiring, because especially in a fast growth tech type environment, you do a hell of a lot of hiring. And I think someone who's been a really good coach, like someone who has not just brought great people in, but then set them up for success and let go of the reins, essentially, and let them do great things. So, if they're interviewing and saying a lot of, I did this, it's probably a big turnoff from my perspective. I want the people who are talking about how they set other people up to achieve great things, and how they help to align a bunch of different initiatives in the right direction.
Awesome. Now I want to do a kind of round robin type question. Maybe we can start with you, Anshul. The emerging technologies, what's disrupting your sector? Play futurist for a minute. What do you think's happening that's relevant to your space?
It's an interesting question, right? Like, unless you're building a fairly technical product, like at the size we're at, the technology doesn't matter heaps, right? Like, you're building a product that people are going to use, and you've got fairly limited resources, which means almost by necessity, unless it is some kind of like technical innovation that is the core of your product, there's nothing crazy. I mean, like an obvious direction for us personally at Elenta to go in eventually, once we've collected enough data, is kind of down like the machine learning AI route, and there's lots of cool things we can do there, and that's a fairly well talked about trend. And obviously, as you get to scale, there's things around managing scale, keeping things performant, keeping things consistent. But I'd say for a fairly small size company, technical challenges are less what we think about, and it's probably more building the right thing at all.
Building the right thing, so much harder than you think. Anyone else have comments on what they're seeing as emerging or disrupting, changing in their space?
In our space, so we're in very much the HR space. I think HR tech, that being specifically, I think what we've seen over the last couple of years is almost all of our competitors being acquired by HRSs in particular, so doing more of a stack consolidation. And so for us, I think the way we've been looking at that space is that for us to continue to compete, we need to spend a lot more of our time and energy connecting into the ecosystem. So building APIs, building integrations, partnering with other companies in order to create the equivalent of that sort of integrated stack that our competitors are now kind of naturally getting, if you like, by being acquired by these larger Goliaths. So that's specific to our industry, I think, but there's just definitely been a lot of consolidation over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's happening is certainly in the classified space, we're impacted by expectations that are changing exponentially because of big companies like Google, Apple, Facebook. So what ends up happening is you're a small, relatively small company, a much smaller technology team, but people still expect your search to work the same way as it does on Google, for example, where they have thousands of engineers and you've got, dozens. So I think that can be particularly difficult. I think another interesting area that's kind of been emerging for us is that the classified space has, for a long time, been focused around a listing. So you have an item you want to sell and somebody comes looking for, an item to buy. Where we see now, because of social networks, that people are much more interested in the profile of the buyer and the seller. They actually want to know who they're buying from, rather than just details on the item itself. So that throws up interesting kind of challenges for us as a business, because suddenly, you need an awful lot more data about your customer than you had before. A lot more information. You need the customer to freely give you that information, and then you need to be able to make sure you keep that information secure. So yeah, just interesting challenges that we're seeing.
Ian, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I mean, software is getting more and more complex by the day, and the sorts of products people demand are getting more complicated too. And as a result, it's becoming more and more difficult for software teams to kind of align on product, customer, and sort of business decisions. So one of the trends we're seeing is an increase in the product ops role coming out of companies like Silicon Valley companies, which is kind of good for us, because that's sort of what we're trying to productize, is to create an integration layer to help these various teams to make aligned decisions on customers, product, and business strategy as well.
Really strong theme around the integration and communication. That kind of leads me into my next question about data management, security. How should early stage companies be thinking about right sizing what they're doing?
So the sort of strategy we took was to kind of add a human element to it. It's a lot easier to care about something when you can relate to it. So about communicating, what's the impact of a data breach in a real world situation? What does it mean to your customers if that happens? It's a lot easier to care if you can understand what that means to another person. But I mean, there's these simple approaches that are quite effective, like principle of least privilege. People shouldn't have access to things they really need. Yeah, there's a whole list of different things you can do like that. Also putting together good technical material, things for people to read through, understanding why you do things. So, if you say, oh, we put all these sort of AWS policies in place, why have you got them there? How do they work? If you give people something interesting to read, they tend to remember it a lot better.
Great. So the next question then is kind of going to infrastructure and, architecting the business. So when you're getting started, it's really easy to make decisions that have a long tail impact to undo. If you are going to build your company's infrastructure from scratch again, what do you wish that you knew?
I wish I knew the size it was going to be. I think everyone has a similar thing, but I think a couple of things. It's great having, high 2020 vision and all of that, but I think I would like to have understood how big apps were going to be and how prevalent they were going to be. I think we would have completely changed the structure of how we approached building apps. But also just in terms of infrastructure itself, I think having something that's scalable in terms of infrastructure is so important. And I think Gumtree, long before I started, was relatively small in Australia, but then had a massive growth trajectory. And then suddenly, you know, 1 in 3 Australians were using us every month. And all of our hardware and infrastructure was still hosted out of Amsterdam because no one expected us to get that big. So yeah, I think generally infrastructure and things like decisions around apps and the technologies you were going to use, but things move so fast and the expectations change so quickly. It's really difficult to predict these things in advance, I would say.
Anyone else have an anecdote on what you wish you'd known?
I wish I'd known AWS's roadmap ahead of time. The number of times, it still happens to us all the time, the number of times that we dedicate a month worth of work towards a feature to work around something that's missing on AWS, only for them to then release something that's better that just means we throw away all our code. I reckon we have burnt a lot of engineering time doing that. It kind of makes sense in a way, right? Like, because you just kind of, AWS is this kind of layer that you can sit on top of, so you kind of float right up to the limits of where they are today, and of course the things you want them to do are the things everybody else wants them to do, so that's what they're working on, and then it gets released. But yeah, that's burned us quite a few times in wasting a lot of engineering time.
I saw a lot of nods. Great. Maybe we can now share some of the biggest stuff ups. Like, what are some examples? And nobody's going to get out of answering this question. What are some examples of times that you really messed it up?
Do you want me to go first?
Sure.
I've seen a few questions around microservices in the chat as well. For us, I think it was moving from monolith to microservices. And I think I'm still very, very much set on that was the right move to be doing in terms of breaking up the monolith. And I think because, from my perspective, the way I kind of look at it is, it becomes the monolith, I think, is the right answer for an early stage company, because it's, you've got one asset to deploy, you're all working in the same code base. There's a lot of things you get for free working in a monolith, and it's easy to kind of get the whole team around the, conforming on standards and so forth. The problem with a monolith is the bigger it grows, the harder it is to keep that consistency. And by the time you get above about 50 engineers, it's really easy. I'm sure there are teams that have managed to get it working well, but you'd have to have really strong discipline around that team to make that work. And so beyond about 50, what our experience, at least in a fast growth tech environment, was that the monolith became increasingly complex and increasingly hard to work in, and increasingly, frankly, just spaghetti code. And so that was what kind of drove our intentions to move towards microservices. And I think we've been on a very long and painful journey that has seen us building and then rebuilding multiple moves and dumping assets and trying again in lots of different ways. And I think now, looking back on the journey, the thing that I wish someone had told me up front is that we went about breaking up the monolith entirely the wrong way. And the reason for that is that I think we took very much a divide and conquer approach. So we thought that breaking up the monolith was about analyzing the domain, working out which domain the boundaries of context made sense, and then separating out those pieces so that we could have individual teams take ownership over that. And long term, that is, I think, still the right answer. The problem is that when you move to microservices, or you move to that service-oriented architecture, all those things that you got for free in the monolith, you don't have anymore, right? So there's now not just one way to deploy, there's like as many microservices as you've got ways to deploy. You have to build your own logging frameworks, you have to build your own permissions frameworks, you have to worry about authentication, authorization, database backup strategies. And so if you don't work on making sure that you have standardized approaches for all of those things first, you end up with N copies of those in all sorts of different ways, and you've burnt a huge amount of engineering time. So the approach we're now taking, which is now, frankly, 5 years too late, is that we're working on conforming and standardizing all those things so that we have, one library that people leverage to do their logging that goes to Splunk in the right formats, and that we can build APIs off the back of and so forth. And so my advice would be, if you think of moving from monolith to, if you're planning on moving from monolith to microservices, start by pulling authentication out and make sure that your monolith is now a service sitting behind a web gateway. And then think about what other back-end processes that you can pull out. Maybe you build your database so that you can standardize the way you do backups, or pull out logging as a library. Do those things way before, come up with standardized deployment paths before you start pulling domains out. That's my advice.
I'll be knocking on your door when we're ready to make a switch, Doug.
Sounds good.
I guess, I don't know if you can call it a stuff up, but this is just from an early stage startup, but we got really fixated on the product and the direction quite early on, which can be quite dangerous because you can kind of go in the wrong direction for a little while before you realize, and it costs a lot of time. But we sort of down tools for probably about a week and a half and just revisited everything we thought we knew. We went through hundreds of customer conversations. We had lots of meetings, which were lots of fun. I made lots of mirror boards, and in the end, I ended up ripping out probably half the code base just because it was easier than trying to rework something that already existed. So I guess my advice there, and you've probably heard it a million times before, is don't fall in love with the product, fall in love with the problem, because you'll be happy to pivot every time then.
Yeah, I think to build on that and what Doug was saying before, I think at least early stage, there are two super common mistakes. Broadly building the wrong thing, but then in two dimensions, building cool product features that nobody wants, and also over-engineering. So like microservices from the get-go, for example. And I think like I made both of those mistakes in the past, and now the approach I kind of take is instead of kind of like to the trends question a bit earlier, instead of trying to predict where we're going to end up or what we're going to need in the future, at least at this point in time, optimize for speed, because it's going to get ripped up and thrown out at some point in the near future, no matter what, and just treat everything like a prototype. And then, like Ian was saying, you're going to feel a lot more comfortable throwing it out and pivoting, whereas otherwise you get attached to it and there's too much sunk costs there.
I totally agree. But I would also say, be prepared, because this will happen as a founder, for that code to not be thrown away, and then 5 years later for everyone to complain about founder code, because it's going to happen. But it's still the right call.
Yeah, that's leads straight into mine, because that's exactly what happened with Gumtree, where you end up in a situation where the application itself was built by a very small number of engineers and was hugely successful. So then it becomes very difficult to add more people to the team when it's suddenly not as successful as it was before, but you need the investment. And I think that was a big learning for me, was actually, you know what, we can't just continue on adding. At some point, you have to actually say, no, we need to stall here, or at least put a percentage of our engineering team on clearing down some of this tech debt so that we can actually continue to move forward. And I think that was a big learning for us, is that we had at the exact time we needed to be able to move very quickly, we couldn't move quickly at all. And so it took us a long time to actually pay down some of that tech debt so that we could actually get back to a position where we could move quickly. So that was a big learning for me. Yeah.
Thank you. That was great sharing. We might move to one more of the pre-prepared questions before we turn it over to audience Q&A on a bit of a higher note. What is your favorite software or tool right now that makes your job easier? Besides Intalayer.
Damn it, that's what I was going to say. We operate asynchronously. because we're basically a fully remote company. So pretty much any tool that facilitates asynchronous communication, it's great, because I'm not getting Slack messages every 5 minutes about something, which is very distracting. But if I was to name one tool, I'd say Vanta's been really helpful. So security is a really big thing for Antler. We've got a lot of pretty sensitive data, so we take it very seriously. And Vanta's just made it super easy to get, to basically SOC 2 Type 1 compliance. And they also provide a whole lot of monitoring and sort of alert on things. It might be little things like if you create a new EC2 instance, having alarms on it, or bigger things like if you were to offboard an employee, making sure you remove their account access. They might have quite privileged access that you probably should get rid of. So that'd be my one.
Anshul, your favorite tool?
It's a tough one. There's a YC startup from the recent batch called InMotion, and it's essentially a Chrome productivity tool. And I got targeted, or I don't know, I saw it like 3 or 4 times, and like I'm going to give it a go. And it's one of those tiny things which just puts keyboard shortcuts in the right places, like checking your calendar, scheduling meetings, that type of thing. And it's a game changer.
Nice. We're going to need that one circulated in the notes. Doug, your favorite tool?
So heavy plus to Vanta, because we're using it too and it is awesome. But I'd have to say for me, this is it would have to be Miro more recently, and I think that's it's probably more of an indication that me as a typical architect, back when we had everybody in the office, my favorite device was a whiteboard. I loved the whiteboard. It was great for a lot of the workshops. And that's probably the biggest thing I've missed since going totally remote for the last last year or so. So Miro, I've just loved being able to kind of collaborate and draw out and zoom out as much as you like and do all sorts of things. So yeah, big heavy plus for Miro.
Yeah, big +1 for Miro for me as well. But I think the other tool, and it's actually funny, it's actually kind of almost describing where we're at in terms of CTOs, but I seem to do so much presentations that, death by PowerPoint is a real thing. So I moved to Canva. And I absolutely love it, just as a tool for making presentations so much more fun and easy to do, especially with my own team, and just making the whole thing a lot more pleasurable when you're doing so many presentations. So, but yeah, big +1 on Miro as well.
Great. Thank you guys so much for your candid responses to that. That's fantastic. I'm going to hand it back over to Sarah now to run the audience Q&A.
Such a great discussion. I have just been listening on the edge of my seat. Thank you, everyone, for your amazing answers. I think it would be great to just take a couple of minutes for everyone who shared those tools just then, drop them in the chat, because I know a lot of people are going to want to use them as well, knowing that you have recommended them. I certainly use Canva every single day and love it. So take a moment to do that. There was actually another question from the audience, Doug, and it was for you around if you could find where those archetypes were that you're mentioning, the Hulk, the engineer, and sharing that as well. That would be insightful.
Okay, I'll see what I can do.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. I'm going to go straight to the Q&A tool, because everyone has kind of been participating. We've got a whole bunch of questions there. Some of them have been upvoted, and I'm going to share them with everyone. So if you want to jump in, do so. If you don't really have anything to add, don't worry about it. We'll go to the next one. We've got about half an hour. So also for our listeners, if you do want to get a question in, make sure you do now, because it'll be your last opportunity. So I'm going to start from the top, and I guess the most upvoted question here is, what is the usual mistake that you often see people make when they transition from engineer to CTO? So that's obviously been a large portion of the conversation tonight, but are there any particular mistakes you see that people make? Maybe it's a presumption, maybe it's wasting time trying to build up a certain skill, maybe it's just a common thing that you see in the hiring process or you have seen in other companies. Can anyone touch on that or answer that for us? And if you don't offer yourself, I'm just going to ask anyone. Anshul, how about you?
I mean, I haven't seen many people transition from engineer to CTO, but given, like, I think we touched on this in the discussion a lot, right? Like letting go of the tools, being prepared to move into more of a management role. I think essentially it all revolves around accepting that it's a less technical role and being willing to upskill on management and leadership and coaching, and not being super attached to your baby, which is probably the product you spent the last few years building.
Yeah, awesome. Okay. And it doesn't look like anyone else has got anything to add. So I do feel like we covered that a lot. So I'm going to move on to the next one. This one, I guess, could be answered across any kind of C-suite role, but specifically, let's stick with the CTO. Would you prefer to work with someone who has kind of worked in multiple organizations for a shorter amount of time, or someone that has had a long stint at perhaps one? Is there any preference there? Roisin, do you want to answer that?
That's an interesting question. I guess it would depend on, again, what organizations they worked in. But I feel like if somebody has worked at multiple organizations, they get a broader view of some of the challenges that, you know, might come up, and they might have experienced different organizational structures, different strategies, different tech stacks, and a whole pile of things that could certainly help. At the same time, I think if you've been a CTO for only a very short time at a company, then, you know, you may not have learned anything at all. So I guess it depends on how long. But yeah, I would say, you know, a CTO that's worked at least 3 years at a couple of different companies is probably worth more than a CTO that's only worked at one company for a long time.
Yeah, that's good advice. I think that answers the question perfectly. Doug, one for you. We touched on before, I guess, some upcoming trends, and they could be seen as opportunities, but are there any specific opportunities in the market at the moment where, I guess, engineered tech folk should be looking at playing in? Where do you see the opportunities lying at the moment?
I mean, I guess, are we talking beyond CTO or as CTOs?
This person's asked for engineering managers, tech leads who would like to make the move to either VP of engineering or a GM role. So I guess it's around growth and opportunity and potential.
Yeah, because I mean, I think there's certainly some areas in tech that are that have some massive gaps, right? Like anything around the data engineering, machine learning, and frankly, like the SRE type space, where there's a lot of demand, and I think there's a lot of opportunity to help like fill some of those gaps and fill some of those leadership gaps even. Once you're talking about more like that VP of engineering, CTO, or C-level type role, I think it's probably broader than that. I don't think it's specifically about a particular area. I think it's more about, I think the path to that is probably finding roles where you can take accountability for broader scope, if you like. So maybe it's working in a larger company, but in a role where you're taking accountability for multiple areas and keeping them aligned. I think it's where I'd be looking for people that have got experience working across multiple teams or those sorts of things, and where they're taking accountability for connecting across different business areas. So not just for engineering, but how do we bring that to market, and working with the sales team, working with the marketing team, or taking the financial accountability, so owning the budgets and owning those sorts of things. I think experience in those different areas definitely helps with the transition to a C-level or a VP level role.
Yeah, great answer. There was a question asked, and it's not in the Q&A, but it was asked in the chat probably 20 so minutes ago or so. Roisin, it's probably a good one for you to answer. And Laura, I think you might even be able to answer this as well, having worked with many founders in the Antler program and having your deep tech accelerator experience as well. Are there any barriers for women competing in CTO roles? And I don't want just the women to answer this. Guys, feel free to jump in as well. So maybe Roisin, do you want to start?
Yeah, that's like not a small question. I think there are lots of barriers for women in technology in general. I think that unfortunately means that a lot of women leave the technology industry before getting to such senior roles. And you can actually see the data shows the drop off it gets progressively worse, but at mid-level in their career, which is right at the point where they would be thinking about moving up to this type of role. 56% of women in technology leave the industry, which is a phenomenal number. That's in comparison to 17% of men. So it's quite a drastic number. So that's a big problem. I also think, though, that there is kind of a unique challenge with the CTO role in that it is such a critical role for the business. When a board or a leadership team is looking to hire a CTO, the risk is high. So they want to actually keep their risk profile as low as possible when hiring someone. And so that can mean that they promote someone from within the company that they know, or, you know, they go through a long 12 to 15 week process of, you know, interviews or whatever it is. They do whatever it takes to minimize risk. And if you're faced with a female candidate and a male candidate, it can often come down to a risk profile where, you know, the board decide they're not going to take the risk in hiring a female CTO because they haven't had a female CTO before, or whatever it is. So there can be challenges like that. I think it comes down to, you know, just the perception of women in the industry. Unfortunately. So it is definitely something that, you know, you should take into consideration. But I actually, when I joined Gumtree as CTO, a couple of people kind of approached me and said, oh, you know, we know X female CTO over here and X female CTO over there. And I said, great, we'll, you know, get a group together and start discussing some of the challenges that we see as female CTOs. And I tried to find some, and it was incredibly difficult. And I went through, I think I've told this story before, but I went through LinkedIn trying to find another female CTO in Sydney, and I went through 35 pages of search results before I found another one. So I created a meetup group called the Sydney Female CTOs and CIOs, just to see, kind of like a build it and see if they will come kind of thing. And we have nearly 500 members now, which is amazing. So not all of them are female CTOs and CIOs, but we have a lot of people, supporters who want to actually encourage more women into these roles and want to see more women in C-level positions. So yeah, there are definitely some challenges.
Absolutely, yeah. Well said.
And to add to that, fascinatingly and quite impressively, I don't see this within Australia, but within Antler, Australia, but within every other context, I've seen equally qualified and experienced women alongside their peers not putting their hands up and taking that second seat position. And so a big part of what I'm doing when I'm engaging with women in that role is, but why not? And what would it take to make you comfortable putting your hand up for that? What's the worst that could happen? They say no. You just might get it, and recognizing the bias that many women have towards being fully qualified for a role as opposed to largely qualified for a role, and really just encouraging more women to put their hands up, be willing to take that leadership role and own it, and not wait to be shoulder tapped for it.
Great advice, Laura. Anyone else have anything to add? Doug?
Yeah. So, I mean, I totally agree with everything that's been said. I think, yeah, there's a lot of research out there that suggests that, you know, companies with more diverse, gender diverse boards, more gender diverse founding teams are more successful. I think particularly in the engineering space, we have a big challenge as an industry. That frankly is multi-generational. It goes a long way back. I mean, I remember even in my degree, it would have been at least 95% men in my course. So I think, in terms of creating a gender diverse, ecosystem, we start with massively behind the 8 ball, and then as Roisin was saying, we see larger drop-offs. And I think a big part of that is that we don't have the role models, and that's a it's a vicious cycle. So I think one thing I would say is if you're looking at 2 candidates that look similar, have similar experience, one of them is female, you should think very carefully about hiring that person because they've had a tougher time to get to where they are. So frankly, they're the better candidate. So I think that's definitely one thing. I think also it's worth to kind of echo what Laura was saying around the research that's kind of suggested that for example, what Laura was saying, where it's perhaps a stereotype, but I think research has also kind of suggested that the culture that we've created has kind of created a situation where many women won't apply for a job unless they tick every box, while men will apply if they're ticking at most of the boxes. And so I think those sorts of things, I think it's really important for people to think about in the way they write job applications. What's the language that you're using? How do you create job ads that make it clear that as a company you care about diversity in your teams and that you're being really clear about what really is important in the role and what's not. So I think there's definitely plenty that we can and should be doing to improve the situation. But yeah, I think and then the last thing I would say is I think it's on all of us to try and create more opportunities in the more junior levels and help to grow people through. So even if we can't necessarily fix the problem for our generation of companies, how do we make it better for the next generations of companies so that at least the problem is lessened as we go forward? So yeah, that's about all I've got to say on the topic.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Doug. I think visibility is a huge thing. The more women that you see, the more, I guess, self-belief that you can do it, you can have to do it too. So I think that's definitely crucial. I'm going to talk now, or ask you all to talk about low code and no code solutions. There's been a lot of questions about this. I guess, Ian, maybe you can kind of put in your 2 cents first, but there are a lot of platforms around now that offer it. How much demand is there still to build custom software products?
I can't really comment specifically on the demand, but I mean, with no code and low code solutions, you're trying to abstract the complexity. So how much functionality can you capture versus how much complexity can you abstract? It's a really fine balance. And then sure, you could add a configuration layer on top, but then you're getting back to complexity. So it is this ongoing balance. So I suppose, in my opinion, there's always going to be a world for both. It really depends on the application and the complexity that the user wants. I mean, to use a sort of off-the-cuff example, a CMS platform like WordPress is supposed to be super simple that anyone can kind of put it together, but you still get WordPress developers. There's still people who make a living out of configuring these tools. So I think there's always going to be a place for both.
Yeah, awesome. And I think, Laura, you're probably in a good place to answer this as well. I guess there was a question earlier around whether there's a need to have a technical founder in a business or a CTO in a startup. This is a question Antler's often asked, and we look at it from a VC lens, but I think you could also comment on it from, I guess, the strength of a team lens. What can you say about that? And can the no code solution in a team that doesn't have a technical co-founder or a CTO be successful?
Massively controversial question. My N=1 view on this is that companies fail on market and team 9 times out of 10 before they fail on technology. And so you absolutely have to have the technical capability within the business to build your business at scale. But for that 0 to 1, it's all about proving whether people give a damn and are willing to engage with your product and pay money for it. There are some products that are so technical that you cannot do that, and you cannot low or no code your way into something that proves the market. However, there's a huge chunk that absolutely can do that. One example of a portfolio company who just closed her Series A round in 4 freaking days, which was amazing. Her MVP was literally a Slack channel. She proved the market by mocking up the value proposition in a Slack channel. And that, you don't have to have code for that. And then as soon as you prove that and can get investment, you can get that amazing technical talent around you. So it is specific to how important the tech is to the business and how much market risk sits around that opportunity.
Yeah, definitely. We're also seeing a lot of founders validate their products on WhatsApp as well. I know that that's, in addition to Slack, being a place that they're going to get that kind of early traction and find whether there's demand at all. So I digress. But the next question that has been upvoted in the Q&A is, can product managers become CTOs gracefully? Anyone out there that can answer this? Anshul, do you have any kind of 2 cents on this question?
I'm not 100% sure what gracefully means. I mean, again, it depends on the size of company you're going into. If you're going into a tiny company, then if you're a product manager, you probably do want to be technical enough. Like, chances are you're going to be writing a lot of code at the beginning. If you're going into a larger company, then, and I'm probably not best placed to answer this, but I think a lot of the experience running and managing product teams, especially if you kind of grew with a company and you were leading engineers at some point, should be transferable into a CTO role at a medium to large size company. I think Doug or Roisin would probably be better for this one.
Yeah, I can jump in. I think I agree with you. I think the only caveat, though, is if you don't have a strong engineering background, then you need to have a really good team. So you need to hire the right people onto your team that will actually help you fill the gaps. And I think that's probably, advice for anyone who becomes a CTO. You're going to have some gaps, and you just have to make sure that whoever you hire onto your team can actually help you fill the gaps that you have. I actually came from a product role into CTO role, but I had actually previously been in an engineering leadership role, so I kind of did both. So it's definitely possible, but if you don't have that engineering background, you need to find a way to plug the gap.
Complementary skill sets on a team is hugely important. Yes, Doug?
Yeah, sorry. I totally agree. It's interesting. Almost every product manager I know has come from being an engineer. So I think, like, in some ways it's a transferable role, and it's partly because there is no degree of product management, right? So most product managers are kind of, they've fallen onto more of the business side after being in an engineering type role. And I think that the question then is, so I think there's a lot about the product management role that that gives you a lot of skills for being a C-level in a company, much more so than an engineering role does, a typical engineering role. So from that perspective, I think it can actually be quite an accelerator to a CTO type role. But I totally agree with Roisin. Like, the challenge is, as a CTO, there's the expectation that you're going to be setting the technical strategic vision for the company. And I think you need to be technical enough to be able to do that, or you need to be able to rely on some people that have that skill set. So I think that's really, really important. But yeah, I think that the opposite is probably also true. If you've only done the engineering side, how do you gain some of the business knowledge and and the skills that you would gain in a product manager type role?
Yeah, awesome. Great answers. We've only got time for a few more questions. So I'm going to ask Laura one, because this is probably right up your alley, Laura. And then we're going to excuse her because she has actually got to go and catch a flight to Melbourne. She is the busiest person I know, and we're very lucky to have her time. So Laura, one of the questions from Mohammed actually is, where does one start in shaping better commercial thinking? So probably, it's something that we're thinking about right now. Investment committee is next week. Can you kind of share a few ideas around that?
Yeah. Oh, geez, where do you start on that? First of all, would be to embrace the strong opinion weakly held mentality. You need to strongly believe in what you're doing, but it needs to be weakly held in that you're always willing to learn and change your opinion and adapt and evolve how you're approaching and thinking about things. And get embedded alongside the people that you want to be using your product, and deeply understand how they experience the problem. But one often overlooked particularly in the medical sector, which is where the breadth of my background is in what are the workflows. If you're asking people to change their workflows, particularly in an enterprise or a medical setting, that can be really difficult if that's an ingrained behavior. And so you have to understand all of the complexities around the commercial uptake and the opportunity, and that you're going to get not just scratching your own itch, but that you're going to get thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people to agree, yes, that's also my itch, and I would also like it scratched, and I'll pay money for that. And so that way of thinking about the commerciality of the opportunity is really critical. Thanks so much. And I'm sorry I've got to hop off early. Really appreciate everyone's time.
Thanks, Laura. We appreciate you making the time as well. We're going to continue on for a few more questions, so hang around. Be sure to ask them in the Q&A still. The next one is quite popular, and it's from Liam. Liam asks, task management, distribution of tasks, in-house management systems or software like Jira, Notion, and so forth to manage tasks. What do you all use? Ian, do you want to start?
Yeah, we use all of those. Jira, Notion, Google Drive. I use notepads. I've got about 50 notepads going on the fly for various things. But in terms of task management, we put together quite a structured kind of workflow from the start, just so that, people coming in had something to work with. Because, when you just a startup with 3 founders, there isn't this kind of work culture to push things along. So having a nice structured system, feature branch, development, UAT staging, having all those where everyone gets to have a sort of a check and see what's going out also keeps everyone in the loop. So yeah, it's pretty much where we use Jira as the main task tracking tool.
Thanks, Ian. How about you, Doug?
Yeah, Jira and Trello tend to be the 2 most common across most of our teams. Personally, I've been trying to use Todoist, which I use badly, I would say. But I mean, in terms of task, it's a tricky problem. Like, I think I find myself split across a heap of different tools all the time. And yeah, I think it's probably more about discipline rather than what specific tool you're using, which is something I'm still working on personally.
Aren't we all? Does anyone else have any others that they want to add? Maybe a quirky one that's not often thought of? No? Cool. Sounds like we're all on the same page. Probably time for 1 or 2 more questions. Are there any books, courses, or talks that any of you recommend to broaden someone's horizon if they're thinking about positioning themselves to take that step up and take the CTO role? Has anyone read anything recently or been to a great seminar or virtual conference that you can think of?
It's not a virtual conference, it's an actual conference, but there is the CTO Summit, which happens in Sydney. I think it's every year. It's run by Yao. They do record all their sessions, so I'm not sure if they're freely available online. You may need to register or sign up or something like that, but there's some great talks in there that I would definitely recommend. I have yet to read a book on how to become a CTO. Maybe there's some that people could recommend, but yeah, definitely I found that conference very helpful.
Yeah, it's a great resource. We love their events and recommend them to our founders. They're a great community and they publish some great resources as well. Maybe resources is a good one. Does anyone follow someone interesting on Twitter? Do they follow a particular thread on Reddit that they find there's lots of, kind of nuggets of gold or anything like that?
I follow lots of interesting people on Twitter, but if anyone wants to actually broaden their horizons and have a few more senior female technical people, have a look through my follow list. One of the women that I really enjoy is Charity Majors, and so she's the CTO of honeycomb.io, which is an observability company. They built observability tools, which I really, really like. She can be a bit full on, but it's always interesting to hear what she has to say. But yeah.
Awesome, thanks. To wrap up, it'd be really cool if we could rip around the Zoom and kind of share your one piece of advice for everyone listening who wants to kind of take that role of CTO. Maybe they're hesitant or they're just still firming up their skills or building up their confidence. Maybe it's advice that you would have given yourself before your first CTO role. But maybe starting with Doug, Ian, Anshul, and then Roisin, can you share that one piece of advice for everyone? Lasting words.
I think my one piece of advice is being a CTO. It can be a really difficult role. Like any of the C-level roles, it can be a really difficult role because ultimately the buck stops with you in that space. So I think it's really important to find the support network. So are there people that you can learn from or can be your coaches, whether that be paid coaches or whether it be ideally also people who have been CTOs or are CTOs in larger companies that you can learn from? What groups can you join? I mean, Roisin was talking about starting a group for female CTOs, like things like that. I think it's really important to kind of find that network that you can support, just so that you've got someone to kind of ask those questions like, hey, how even it's simple as things like what are your salary bands, but much more complex things as well, like how do you think about these problems or those sorts of things. So I think that's probably my advice, is that don't try and do it on your own. There's a lot of other people out there going through similar things or have been through similar things, and how do you get the support from them that you need.
Awesome, thanks Doug. How about you, Ian?
I guess this is more generalized to just sort of joining a startup, because I guess that's where my current experience is more relevant. But you'll never feel ready. As a child, you look at adults and you think they've got it worked out, and then when you become an adult, you look at other people and you think they've worked it out. Everyone thinks everyone else has worked it out. No one knows what they're doing. If you think you've got the grit to keep trying things and you're ready to just keep pivoting and changing, you're not stuck on the same thing, you're as ready as you're ever going to be.
Great advice. I love that. Awesome. Anshul?
I think we've touched on this one quite a bit, but don't get too attached to the code and the product and what you're building. Just be comfortable, letting the product kind of take its own direction, but also removing yourself from whatever you've created and giving it away to other people.
Nice one. And last but not least, Roisin.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's just been said, totally, especially what Ian was saying. You'll never know until you actually just do it. Somebody gave me some good advice at the beginning, which was to get yourself almost like a board of directors, a set of personal mentors, but a group. And then, get some people that you can really trust their feedback, that you can bounce things off of. I think that's really, really important. And that can be inside and outside of your organization. You need that independent view. And I think that was really good advice for me. Yeah.